Welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast. Today's guest is Mikki Williden, nutritionist, PhD researcher, and marathon and even ultra-marathon runner. She holds a marathon PB of 2:55 and run ultras like the Grand to Grand Canyons. Today's episode we discuss a lot about nutrition, how nutrition helps us recover faster, but also how nutrition can keep us healthy while we're training. Cover grounds like what's our water intake and how does that help us recover after a run. We discussed the 10 grams per hour carbs research, how we can experiment and how we can become a faster but also a healthier athlete. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hi Mikki, and welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast.
Joost, thank you so much for inviting me on as a guest. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. For the listeners that don't know you yet, can you explain a bit about yourself? How did you become a sports nutritionist?
Yeah, so I have long been passionate about nutrition and exercise since a teenager, really. And I studied both physical education at university and in fact took up nutrition because I realised if I just did physical education as a degree, I would probably have to be a phys ed teacher or a personal trainer. Neither appealed. So I took up nutrition and then just really loved the research side of it. Carried on to from my science degree to do a master's in childhood obesity, plus then did a PhD whilst working as a lecturer in public health. All along the way, as an endurance athlete, really interested in that side of things. And so when I started practicing, when I was in my early 20s, really, I started seeing a lot of athletes like me, I guess. And so as I've developed my career, along with just being an endurance athlete, I've got a large portion of my clientele are, in fact, endurance athletes, just like me.
Yeah, you're an endurance athlete. What's your history there?
Yeah, so I was much more of a bookworm as a child, actually, and as a teenager. But when I was at high school, my phys ed teacher said to me, "Mikki, you're never going to be that good at sport because you're too good in the classroom." And he was a basketball coach at the time, actually, and all of my girlfriends played basketball. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to teach him. And so over the course of that summer, I started taking up running, and I was quite chubby, actually. I took after my mum, I suppose. And so I took up running. I got fit and then sort of grew out of my younger sort of, girl body, if you like, and just started looking a bit more like a runner. And then I got back to school that following year, and because our school year starts in February here in New Zealand, and my teacher saw me, and he's like, he just couldn't believe the shift and the change in me. And so his comment motivated me to start running. And then he was right, I was never very good at basketball because I'm terrible with any sort of prop. But I just loved running, Joost, and so I've just sort of continued that along the way. And so it sort of shifted from being I guess, quite serious marathon runner, I suppose, in my late 20s. I've got a PB of 2:55 in the marathon some years ago now, and now I sort of am much more into the trail running. I love road running. It does have my heart, but my body at 48 doesn't love it as much as I wish I could do. So I love long trails as well. And then of course I combine my endurance running with strength-based training, with some cross training. I might be a bit like you in that I just love training. So, any opportunity to do it, I'm probably going to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's probably true for a lot of runners.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did some ultras as well. I saw.
Yes. So more recently, my husband, he's very interested in trail running. He sort of got me much more interested in it. I'm not very. I feel like if you were younger and your parents took you hiking and you were into that outdoorsy stuff, I feel like you've got the skill base that's very difficult to develop as an adult. And I never had that as a child, really. But I'm definitely better now than I was 10 years ago. And so he's encouraged me on the trails. And last year, particularly, we just sort of discovered multi-day run run events like the Southern Lakes Ultra here in New Zealand. If any of your listeners want an amazing multi-day endurance run, highly recommend that. The dollar is very good. Like, it would be very cheap for anyone in Europe listening to do it. So we did that one, and then we've also done the Grand to Grand it was from the Grand Canyon to the Bryce Canyon. We did that in September last year, which again was just such a wonderful experience. So, as you get older, Joost, you have to sort of slow down. So the only thing to do is to go longer, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And now you have a travel agency as well. We're coming to New Zealand.
Yeah, good. That's perfect.
I can also imagine that your running influences the way you teach or coach nutrition. Did that have any influence?
Yeah, I think so. Like, a couple of sort of key things, I suppose, happened along the way. So I was, as I said, I did a science degree in nutrition. I really learned that quite conventional way of thinking about nutrition and thinking about fueling. And it wasn't until I was a senior lecturer at AUT University here in Auckland, and our research group got interested in the concept of lower carbohydrate diets for people with type 2 diabetes. And, our whole group essentially were endurance-based athletes. Like my colleague and the professor heading the group, Grant Schofield, who you should get on your podcast. He's amazing. He sort of got interested in this idea of low carb or metabolic efficiency, actually, which is something that I think it was a phrase. Maybe it was coined even by Bob Seeberhor, who is a registered dietitian in the States. But this idea that, in order to be a better endurance athlete, you have to increase your ability to burn fuel, and carbohydrate is a limited fuel source. The average person might store anywhere from 500, maybe even 700 grams of carbohydrate in the muscle, in the liver, transiently in the bloodstream, but at some point it's going to run out, was the thinking back then. And we might have a different understanding about how our body utilizes carbohydrate, but anyway, this is in comparison to the hundreds and thousands of calories we've got stored as fat on our body. And even the leanest runner could run several back-to-back marathons and not actually run out of a fuel supply if they were able to tap into their fat stores. And so we became very interested in this concept of metabolic efficiency, becoming better able to utilize fat as a fuel source. And I guess that sort of got me into thinking in a more sort of lower carb paradigm. And that was back in about 2011, 2012. And I think probably since then, Joost, my thinking has evolved sort of further into much more of a carb cycling, carb appropriate type approach, where instead of, like, probably in the early days, I was probably very strict in the low carb space. And now I guess I probably think much more broadly about, less about not low carb, but about how do we get more metabolically flexible. And so being able to burn not just fat, which a lot of endurance athletes can't really do, to the extent that they, that might be optimal, but both try to burn both fat and carbohydrate, which is really I spend a lot of my time talking about with athletes.
Yeah, because I feel when I talk to athletes that fueling and nutrition sometimes underlooked. That they just think, if I eat carbs, I'm golden, it's good. But as you say, to be metabolic flexible, it means we have much more energy we can use.
Yes, and also, to your point about, we don't, as long as I've got enough carbs, I'm good, or I burn a lot of calories, and as long as I'm recovering well, it doesn't matter what I eat.
Exactly,
I guess I spend a lot of time talking about diet quality with people as well. And if someone's trying to follow like if someone who is like me, like a middle-aged athlete, who is a lot of my audience, is trying to follow a higher carb approach, then not only is it their metabolic health, which can be compromised because we are age groupers, we are not elite, but their diet quality, like there's not enough room in their diet for protein and fat if it's all being crowded out, trying to get 8 or 7 grams of carbohydrate per kg body weight.
Yeah, exactly. Was that Dr. Maffetone who said fit but unhealthy?
That is a brilliant paper. Yes, Phil Maffetone and Dr. Paul Lawson, who would also be an excellent, if you haven't already had Paul Lawson on, excellent guest.
Yeah, not yet, but he's on the list.
Good.
Yeah, I listen to his podcast every time, every week. One of my favorites.
It's very good.
Yeah. But how do we become metabolically flexible?
Yeah, so I feel some people would argue that just by virtue of training as an endurance athlete, you're going to help that sort of metabolic engine and help sort of drive those endurance adaptations that allow you to burn fat as a fuel source. But in my experience, actually seeing lab values of the amount of carbohydrate and fat oxidized at rest by an endurance athlete or at very low intensities, this isn't just my understanding, it's what I believe the literature also shows, is that actually diet is one of the biggest drivers of your ability to burn fat or carbohydrate. So making shifts in the sort of daily diet of an athlete is the main lever to pull with regards to improving metabolic flexibility. And as endurance athletes, what I do want to be quite clear about, I suppose, is when I'm talking about a lower carb approach, I'm not talking about a ketogenic diet. Like, I'm not talking about 50 grams of carbohydrate or less. Like, I don't think that, I think these are, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to do for for some athletes, but I do feel like athletes take it a bit far sometimes, and they don't recognize the fact that they're depleting their glycogen on the daily with their training puts their body into a low carbohydrate state. So it's not necessarily a low carb diet as much as it is about sort of driving that low glycogen state. And that can happen with some endurance athletes depending on the training load when they're still consuming about 200 grams of carbohydrate a day, which is compared to sort of standard carbohydrate load is still like a lower carb diet. And I guess the point to be made here is that, you know, when we're thinking about low carb or even ketogenic, like a ketogenic diet is, it's more about getting into ketogenesis much more than the ketogenic diet. Yeah, it's driving that process. So I did just want to say that because sometimes people will hear low carb approach for athlete and they'll go and they'll pick up a dietary recommendation that is much more appropriate for someone who is more sedentary, and then they crash and burn. All that said, timing of your carbohydrate is really important, and it's either sort of cycling your carbohydrate during a week, or it's optimizing your carbohydrate during your training sessions, and like fueling for the work required, actually. So I guess an approach, if anyone is sort of interested in listening, you know, like if you wanna go down this route, like one of the best things to do is to choose a time in your training year where you've got the time and space to be able to practice, I suppose, because and that generally is like base training. Like, you don't have your A race coming up within, 12 weeks or anything like that. It might be 16 or 20 weeks before you've got the race you really care about. And you want to give yourself a good 6 to 8 weeks, I think, where you can just sort of consistently train, get some volume in, but keep it quite low intensity, because the low intensity nature of your training plus a lower carb approach can both help sort of improve your ability to burn fat. And the reason I say low intensity is because as soon as you lift the intensity higher, that sort of will push the body into that glycolytic state. It'll want to be burning glycogen and carbohydrate. Whereas at the lower intensity training, when the heart rate is kept low and you're sort of building your base, it's easier for your body to utilize fat as a fuel source. And in terms of carbohydrate timing around that, we would want to fuel beforehand, but keep it low carb. So if you train in the morning, you might just have like a protein shake with some peanut butter in, which still has calories, but it doesn't have any glucose. That is then going to sort of create that insulin increasing in the body that will suppress fat oxidation. So you go in with some calories on board, but they're low carb. Then the body has to search for alternative fuel. And And then that's when it starts kicking up those enzymes that allow you to burn fatty acids. Because of course, as you're getting up in the morning, you're actually coming out of an overnight fast and your liver glycogen is low. And that is the thing, like your muscle glycogen will still probably be fine, but your liver glycogen is low. And that's what we need in order to help sort of enhance this effect. So, and then in this, I guess you've got a couple of choices. Like you might decide just to be low carb across the board during this phase, which, if anyone's interested, there's a PhD, Marco Altini. He's got a fabulous blog, and I think when we were chatting on text, I think you were either familiar with him or I alerted you to him. He's got an excellent Substack account, which is free to access, which gives you a really good sort of protocol. But, like you keep carbs low across the board, you keep calories. Calories don't have to be low, but carbohydrate is low. But then if you are bringing in some carbohydrate, it's sort of post-training in those earlier phases. So you're able to replete your glycogen in your muscles, which then will allow you to continue training. So I guess there are various routes, but it's that carbohydrate cycling in your diet and or keeping the carbs low, which really is the driver.
Yeah, because as you explained, it does take quite some time to be fat adapted, that your body can use that fat. I'm a keto athlete because of reactive hypoglycemia, so I don't have a choice to be keto. And it took me, I think, 3 months to get really back on the training I did before. But I'm stronger now for it. So I'm really glad I found also you and your podcast, because it helped me to achieve this.
Nice.
But it does take some time.
It does, and I feel like, as athletes, we have to, it's really patience. We have to really sort of learn to be patient in that. And I think Joost, you give such a good case as to where a ketogenic diet or being a keto athlete can be really helpful. That rebound hypoglycemia it's a real problem for, a small subset of athletes. Something else I'd say, this is why I really enjoy talking about it, is because there are a lot of athletes who, quote unquote, sort of got away with like a terrible diet by virtue of the fact that they were runners and they were endurance athletes, but actually eventually it will catch up with them as they head on into middle age, and you just, you can't protect yourself against that, a rubbish diet at our age. In addition to the stress of training, it just impacts on all of our physiology, as, Dr. Phil Maffetone and Dr. Paul Lawson talk about in that paper. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So now we've talked about fat as a fuel, there's glucose as a fuel, of course there's lactate, which isn't just a waste byproduct, but is also a fuel. We can teach your body to use it as a fuel.
Yeah.
So those are the three main sources of energy. You've interviewed Professor Prins lately about the 10 grams of carbohydrates an hour study. Now we have a good idea what types of fuel we can use for running. What did this study look at, and what does it teach us as runners?
Yeah, I like, it was so great to have the opportunity to talk to Dr. Prins about this, and it really just looked at, like if you look on not just X, not just social media, but also in the science literature, people are studying these super high doses of carbohydrate as how do athletes tolerate that? Does this even improve performance? And you have like some quite vocal people who are out there doing 120 grams to 150 grams of carbohydrate an hour and getting great results in terms of winning races and not having gut related issues and things like that. Because of course, as you'll know, Joost, and I'm sure your listeners will as well, part of the problem with carbohydrate intake isn't just the metabolic health implications, which some athletes may experience, but it's the GI distress that over 80% of us can experience either in training or in a race, right? So I guess Prins and his research group, which of course involves Dr. Andrew Kutnick and Professor Tim Noakes, are looking at these sort of alternative models for fueling. And they've conducted a number of studies. Earlier studies that Dr. Prins and I have discussed on the podcast involve sort of 5K run times and middle-aged athletes on ketogenic diets, and the fact that their performance isn't negatively impacted when at I think it was a VO2 max was sort of hit at 85% VO2 max or something across that 5K performance. Without any carbs, but their 10 grams of carbohydrate study really was just looking at, how much carbohydrate is required to prevent the brain bonking, actually. So Dr. Prins and Noakes and Dr. Kutnick have, also brought out a narrative review on carbohydrate requirements for athletes and, what are these different pools of glucose that the body uses in order to fuel, and sort of I guess in contradiction to the notion that we tap into our muscle glycogen and that's our primary fuel source, they're like, well, actually, it's more about a smaller glucose pool. And if we can stop that hypoglycemia, much as the way that you experience, and we prevent that brain bonking on a little amount of carbohydrate, then that's all that we actually need to do. Now, I'm not saying that... certainly that's definitely created waves in the sports nutrition field for sure. And then I think it's a super interesting space to sort of look at. But essentially, they showed that there was no performance detriment to providing 10 grams of carbohydrate an hour to cyclists in terms of the work output that they were able to put out. So, yeah, super interesting.
Yeah. And maybe we can circle back a little bit. You just mentioned the two pools where we store glucose. When we eat a gel or glucose-based food, where is it stored and how is it used?
Well, if we're eating it on the go, we're using that glucose.
Yeah. And we, where do we store the glucose, the two pools?
Yeah, into the liver or into the muscles.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
So there are more ways to store the glucose we use.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well if you look at carbohydrate oxidation rates, and this is off the top of my head. So please, if listeners are listening, they're like, "That's not right." Absolutely, let us know, and you'll be right. But from memory, there have been studies looking at how much of that carbohydrate is actually oxidized that athletes take in, and I believe that some studies have shown that athletes might take 90 grams of carbohydrate, but only 60 grams of it is oxidized. So where is this other 30 grams going? And this may be the reason why athletes start getting GI issues, because a lot of that carbohydrate isn't being digested. It's being sort of fermented in the upper and sort of gut, and it's creating some of this GI distress that we experience. And similarly, with those really high doses of carbohydrate that we were chatting about, like that's the question, like where does that carbohydrate go? Because it's not possible to actually oxidize it all. And so the likes of some super elite athletes, they're fine, like their gut appears to be fine, and they have no problem in terms of maybe not necessarily using it, but no gut related issues, but there's no way to know sort of where it goes. So it's interesting. So do you actually need it is the point, I suppose.
Before we continue, a quick word about base bodies. The conversation I have with Mikki today is exactly how I coach beginners through elites. We build a base that actually holds. We look at nutrition so you can stay healthy while you're training. We're working towards your next PB in a healthy, sustainable way. Is that something you would be interested in? Do you need some guidance in your training? Are you fed up with static plans that doesn't actually work for your life, your situation, your family, your work? Go over to basebodies.com and check out my coaching. You can book a free 30-minute call with me to see if we're a good fit together. Now let's return to the conversation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you mentioned a brain bonking. We're all familiar with the term bonking, especially in the marathon.
Yes.
So what's brain bonking?
Yeah, totally. And it's essentially, it's like the glucose, like, so the brain has this requirement for glucose, right? Mm-hmm. And when you are low carb, essentially you can, like, if I'm thinking about a ketogenic diet, your body, your body produces glucose. Everyone's body produces glucose at maybe 120 to 130 grams a day, but but that if you're not taking in carbohydrate, that glucose is preferentially going to red blood cell formation, your retinas and your brain essentially. But of course, the brain can run on ketones also, and lactate, and use lactate as a fuel. However, when your brain is like, when you're training and you get that sort of hypoglycemic or you get that sort of bonking, what studies have shown is that this is not due to muscle glycogen stores being depleted. And in fact, you know, a lot of the time when they look at that glycogen depletion studies, like there's still glycogen in the muscle, yet athletes have bonked. And what they think it is that, and this is what Prins and Noakes were looking at, is that actually it's your brain, it's that central fatigue is actually kicking in, and that's what glucose helps protect against. And that's why that small amount of glucose is the amount required, or is that, is sufficient to help prevent that. And that's their argument, that that smaller glucose pool is really just to help with help prevent that brain hypoglycemia.
Yeah, exactly. So it's more of protecting the brain so it won't stop our muscles from working.
Yes, which is, Joost, I'm not sure if you're familiar, I'm sure you are actually, and listeners may be familiar with this as well, but there are like a number of studies in cyclists looking at carb rinsing, and I'm not sure if, and so for those...
We've spoken about it, yeah.
Oh, you have, yeah, amazing. Yeah. Like, I think that's super interesting too, which sort of speaks to this idea as well, like a small amount of carbohydrate in your mouth just sends signals to your brain to increase motor output. I mean, if that really just, I think it just really highlights that there are different mechanisms with which the brain reads energy and how to use that energy. Yeah,
it's such an interesting topic because we think training or running is just a matter of workout and training, but it's also a metabolic event in our body. It's such an interesting field to combine all these things. To train our body to burn fat, to clear lactate and reuse it, and train our bodies to handle glucose in the most optimum way. Be sparing with it so we can use it later on in the race.
I agree, and I feel, and I like the way that you put that, because I think even this is a much broader topic of conversation, but like that stress, that metabolic stress, like, stress is everywhere, and as athletes, not only do we put our body under stress, but there's diet stress, but then you've got work stress and family stress, and not that everything is a stress, but I think sometimes in life we underestimate the impact that stress can have on our sort of performance as an athlete, particularly if we use our sport as an outlet for stress. Like I think that's it's interesting, and it's relevant to this conversation because, a body in a stressed state, that will shift fuel substrate use as well. Like it will push you more towards being a glucose burner, and it can suppress that fat oxidation too. So which again is cool for low intensity work, making sure you recover properly and all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's also something that the study looked at, right? That if we take high amounts of carbs, what you say, you suppress the fat burning capacity.
Yeah.
So that's also very, very interesting. By thinking we have to fuel more gels and carbs, we're actually down-regulating our fat burning.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why, if someone's embarking on this approach, it is, I think, important to be low carb pre-training to avoid that occurring. But I will say that once you've been in this sort of approach, and I don't have a timeline, I can't tell you it's after 6 months or after 12 months, I don't know. I suspect it's fairly individual, but if they were to get their fat oxidation measured in a lab and were taking on board gels, they'll find that even if they have a gel pre-training, that actually they're still able to burn fat as a fuel source. And this is that whole concept where we sort of begun our conversation, that we want to build this metabolic efficiency so we become metabolically flexible. So if someone's listening to this thinking, does this mean I can never have a bagel before I go running again? It's like, well, no, it doesn't actually mean that. It means just maybe for the first 6 months you can't, but ultimately your body will become much more flexible at utilizing both fuel sources.
And it makes sense to be sorry, that we're not just training our body to burn different fuels in training, but throughout our entire day, because we're just running for X amount of hours each week, but we're eating the entire day. So if we want to be metabolically flexible, we'll have to adjust our entire nutrition.
I think so, absolutely. And I also think from the other aspect to it is, of course, moving through the day, right? And, you know, like, I'm not sure about the athletes you coach, Joost, or the people you know, but I know a lot of athletes who will do all their training in the morning, but then actually sit for 10 hours, which from a metabolic perspective isn't sort of ideal either. So it's, it's all important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if we make this practical, how do you approach nutrition during the day and for fueling for a race or running?
Nice.
Any broad advices? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So if we start with a daily diet for an athlete, I like some of my athletes love counting macros, others don't, and I think it's, you know, depends on what your tolerance is for arduous tasks of tracking properly, because it's not easy and it has to be done properly if you bother. But generally speaking, I like to anchor an athlete's meal in protein. First and foremost, and if you are lower carb, you do actually require a higher protein load to assist recovery, and if, you know, latest sports recommendations for protein will have endurance athletes at 1.8 grams per kg body weight per day, which, you know, if you are a 60 kilogram, oh, that's quite light, isn't it? But, you know, 70 kilogram athlete, it's, well, whatever, do the math there. So about over 100 grams of protein. However, that might be too light, actually, that 120 grams of protein, depending on the athlete. I'd be curious to know what you eat, Joost. If you talk to the likes of protein researchers, like there is Dr. Jose Antonio, another excellent guest for your podcast, I think. He works with some endurance athletes in different sports, like I think that's Waka Ama, cycling as well. And these are female athletes who are in their 50s eating 3 grams of protein per kg body weight. They're not necessarily low carb. I would say they are lower carb, but they're not super low carb. But it just really speaks to how important protein is for recovery. And I think this is the first shift that people want to make, is actually shifting their diet towards more protein-rich sources, and sort of distributing it across a day. So that's definitely a recommendation I make. And also, like, if you're someone who grazes, like, I don't think that's a great habit to sort of be in. And if you're sort of shifting to a lower carb approach and suddenly you shift out all your fruit and then you start eating nuts and cheeses, like, some people will absolutely drop body fat, but a lot of people, particularly women, end up gaining weight if that's what they do, because they're still eating, they're shifting out their lower calorie, like, carrot for, like, you know, a big block of cheese, which there's a real difference there. So I suggest that athletes eat, you know, 4 times across a day, maybe have something pre-workout, if that doesn't incorporate pre-workout. So they've still got an opportunity to get in the calories that they need. In terms of carbohydrate, it is really individual use, and I would say that men tend to tolerate a lower carb approach compared to women. And if you look at the literature, you won't actually see that there. But anecdotally speaking, over the 15 years I've been doing this approach, I will say that women tend to feel better on slightly higher amounts of carbohydrate, albeit it's still low compared to the sort of population average. But I also really like to sort of shift carbohydrate choices from the cereals and the breads and the pastas. Rice is okay, but it's not that nutritious. You know, it's starch, but it's not like a ton of other nutrients. But I like sort of potato, sweet potato, fruit, legumes for people who tolerate that kind of fiber. Rolled oats is, totally fine as well for some people. And However, if you are just adopting that lower carb approach, then I would probably try to keep this at a minimum initially. Berries aren't particularly high carbohydrate. I see them more as a fiber source than anything else. And then, of course, an abundance of vegetables, non-starchy variety, greens, reds, yellows, and healthy fats as well. So, I mean, healthy fats, what I mean is don't get your fats from processed refined food. And
Exactly,
the way that we're talking is that, like, I don't have a problem with people eating animal fats or anything like that. So yeah, that's generally how you'd set up a daily diet. That's very general, but yeah, how I think about it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's more about clean food, maybe. If you talk about fats, it's the more natural fats.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and do you have any preferred proteins? You said about 1.8 grams per k of body weight. And I used to track all my nutrients in the beginning because, I had to.
Yeah.
So I'm eating about 2 grams of k of body weight on protein, but it was a lot of figuring out how to get it in, to be honest.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say, even though the recommendation is 1.8 grams per kg body weight, like I myself have probably about 2.2 maybe grams per kg body weight, because I feel like, because I'm hungry, so I have an appetite for it. I really like lean meat, chicken, fish. I mean, not lean meat is totally fine as well, but I'm just thinking from protein to calorie ratio, lean meat is going to be higher in protein. Eggs are excellent, but an egg is sort of 6 grams of protein, 6 grams of fat, so it's not necessarily a high protein food, but I like to add in some egg whites with my eggs if I'm having them. I like prawns or shrimp. And those types of fat-free dairy, fat-free cottage cheese, or full fat, depending on your calorie budget. Just depends on what you can allocate. But of course, if someone is plant-based, then tofu and tempeh are better sources of protein. Edamame beans are better sources of protein. Legumes, which are often sort of thought of as protein-based sources for vegetarians, things like chickpeas, red kidney beans, black beans, etc., are actually more of a carbohydrate source, which is fine, but it just means that they're not as high protein as what people believe them to be. And then in addition, of course, I do like a protein powder. Like, I think people need to sort of not view protein powder as a supplement and actually just think about it as more of a food, actually, because of course it is ultra processed, but it's processed in a way that allows us to digest and absorb it. So I really like a good quality whey protein for people who tolerate whey. Whey protein isolate tends to be slightly high in protein. And then, but of course, if you are plant-based, then the benefit of having those plant-based protein powders, that they're stripped of all of the fibers that might otherwise inhibit your ability to absorb that isolate. So I think having a good quality protein powder is really important.
Yeah, and check the labels of the protein powders. It's the more cheaper one is more sugar than protein, probably. So
it definitely can be. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I had to look as well to get a good clean one.
Yeah.
And it can be a search sometime, but they're absolutely available. Yeah. Yeah. So we've discussed pre-race, maybe just eat something before or race or run. The protein, do you do it after your run to help recovery of your muscles?
Yeah, great question. So I guess for a lower carb athlete, as I said, your requirements for protein may be higher, and what we do know about protein timing is that actually it's your total protein across a day, which is most important, actually, rather than overall timing. That said, clinically speaking, if I'm working with an athlete who is following an approach that they're in a calorie deficit, for example, because they're wanting to improve their body composition, then I'm making sure that they've got something around training, because I want them to have a good training session, want them to get the most out of it, and then I want them to recover better. And in a calorie deficit where calories are scarce, I do think that timing is important. But also, I think it's just good habit as an athlete to get into having something when you get in the door from training, like within 30 minutes, if you can get in some protein. This is the time to have carbohydrate, is post-exercise, because we've got these cells in our muscles, we've got these sort of enzymes, GLUT4 transporters, or enzymes that sort of shift to the top of our muscle cell, and they take in glucose in the absence of insulin. So typically speaking, when we eat carbohydrate, we need insulin to increase in order to take the glucose out of our cells, whereas post-exercise, we don't need insulin to do that, actually, because our muscles do it for us. So it means that you're not going to get this sort of like rebound, sort of like low blood sugar because of that insulin release. So I like athletes getting in carbohydrate post, particularly hard training or long training. Like if it's a short run, it's really neither here nor there. Like a 45-minute easy jog, you're fine. Yeah. But if you've got some hard intervals or you've been out for like hours, then it's good practice to get in some carbohydrate post training as well.
Yeah, exactly. I usually take or coach after about 90 minutes of training, then think about fueling during your run, and then after your run is getting more important as well.
Yeah, I like that too. And it depends, of course, on the training load of the athlete. Like if I'm working with someone and they're running 3 times a week, probably not that important. But if they're running like 5+ times, then absolutely it's important. And I think this is the thing as well, Joost, is people need to consider not just the day that they're in, but think about the week that's gone and what you've got coming up, because your body isn't some sort of cash register that sort of balances at the end of 24 hours. Like you've got that accumulated training load, and then you've got something coming up. So it's sort of looking at your week in totality rather than just that sort of day to day.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah. And something completely different, but our water intake. How do you view that? Because I think that's also often overlooked, how important it is to hydrate and hydrate well.
I completely agree, and I'll give you quite an unsatisfactory answer, probably, because dehydration is one of the biggest issues I think with a lot of athletes. Particularly if you're not in the habit of drinking, like you can't rescue yourself if you're dehydrated at the start of a race. Like it's almost like your race is done if you end up at that start line being dehydrated. But actually, it's not. It's very hard to get definitive on X number of litres or milliliters of fluid an individual needs. And this is the most often asked question that I get as a sports nutritionist, but one with a very vague sort of answer. A couple of recommendations, though, that you see out there, which I don't think are necessarily bad at all. Like, there may be a great starting point. Obviously, you've got your 8 glasses of water a day, which has absolutely no scientific basis at all. Another one I see is 0.33 mils per kg body weight as a start, and then adding on for each hour of training. And how much you add on depends on how long you train and the intensity, etc. And another, like if an athlete really does want to work it out, then what they'd do is they'd set up a spreadsheet and they would put in like different columns, and they would be, their starting weight would be in one column, how much fluid they have during the training in another column, their end weight, the condition of their training, was it super windy, was it super hot, were they at altitude, etc. And then they would they'd figure out their sort of fluid requirements, which would be 1.5 times the amount of weight lost as a proxy. And you'd want to do that over a few weeks to determine. But of course, that seems, again, a little bit like work for a lot of people. A couple of extra things, though, since we're thinking about hydration, is that like you don't want to be a hose. You don't want just water, because literally you'll put it in and it'll come right out. You want to be a sponge. You want to be able your cells to take on that water. And this is where electrolytes are important. And particularly low carbers, particularly in those initial phases, your sodium requirements massively ramp up. And this is because when you go low carb, like you drop your insulin levels actually, and this just tells your your kidneys to dump sodium, or dump potassium and sodium actually. So your body's dumping a lot of electrolytes, particularly in that first part, the initial stages of being low carb. So sodium is the electrolyte which pulls the other electrolytes along. So you want to increase your sodium to help sort of maintain that electrolyte balance. And of course, the other reason why low carbers need higher sodium is because we're dropping our glycogen stores. So, and particularly in these first stages, like you're depleting your glycogen, and this is where we store our electrolytes, because for every 1 gram of glycogen, we store an additional 3 to 4 grams of water. And so you drop glycogen, you drop your body water. So sodium can also help sort of hold on to that. And it's quite variable as to how much someone needs. But if you look at the recommendations from some of the, I guess, the grandfathers of low carb sort of nutrition, like Dr. Steve Viney and Dr. Jeff Volek, they suggest, an additional 5 grams of sodium a day, which is quite substantial, albeit
it's a lot.
Yeah, it is. But actually, if you look at the American College of Sports Medicine, I'm going to say American College of Sports. It's either sports nutrition or sports medicine. I think it might be sports medicine, ASCM. Yeah. They actually recommend 5 to 8 grams for endurance athletes, actually, which is it's substantial. And I guess obviously it's climate dependent, but there's that acknowledgement that we lose a lot more electrolytes, so we're going to need to replace them.
Yeah, and the difficult thing with these things, it's experimenting. As you said, the spreadsheet is very good idea. I know for myself, I'm a heavy sweater. If I do a hard workout, I'm covered in sweat and white streaks on my face and clothes.
Yeah.
So I know I need more. And if I do, I recover faster. Especially if I drink a lot of water after my workout.
Yeah.
I didn't do it in the beginning, and I was tired the entire day. But when I replenished my waters, my electrolytes, I was fine the rest of the day. Something so simple as just water that can help us recover faster.
Absolutely. One of the best indicators actually for your hydration needs is, of course, the color of your urine. Notwithstanding the bright fluorescent yellow that occurs because, of the B vitamins that you take in your multivite, ideally it would be a pale yellow color at the end of the day. Like if your urine is sort of dark, for across the majority of the day and you're feeling headachy and fatigued, then you definitely need to do something. And look, the worst case scenario with the sodium is that you get this urgent need to defecate. Like if you like muck up your sodium and take too much, you'll need to run to the bathroom. But if that, and the only other caveat I will say is if you do have high blood pressure, then you do need to be mindful of sodium. But outside of that, for most people, it's been one of these sort of nutritional boogeymen, if you like, that really there's for not great reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that was a great discussion, because now we've covered almost all bases in nutrition for our training, and the meal before, after, the hydration, and the gels. We just covered the study very shortly. It's about 10 grams per hour, but that's also something we can experiment. It's not saying you should just eat 10 grams, but experiment, try. And
I think Joost as well, like with that, I think that 10 grams is like a floor. Like now
exactly.
Like we don't know, but you've got this sort of baseline, and I've run so I did the Grand to Grand, I did Boston Marathon, I did the Southern Lakes Ultra, and I probably had about 15 grams of carbs an hour during Boston Marathon, because it was like a fun run. Like we were just running it to really soak up the atmosphere. In Grand to Grand, I had about 40 grams of carbs an hour, which was perfect. My stomach was good. I felt well fueled, and then I had like a decent hit of carbs after getting in for, after about 5 hours as a minimum each day, but then our longest day was 16 and a half hours. So, but my gut handled that amount. So I'm certainly not thinking that everyone just needs 10 grams an hour, but what I'm thinking is, why not 30 to 60 grams of carbs an hour? Like those traditional sort of like recommendations, like that's a really good sort of starting place. And then the longer you go, the better you are at utilizing your stored fuel, maybe the less you need. So, I mean, that's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a very good overview. Yeah, thank you. There's one more subject I would like to touch briefly. You said it a few minutes back. If we want to lose some weight or body composition, how would you tackle that? Because if we want to lose weight, a lot of runners start running to lose weight.
Yeah.
So maybe they're in a calorie deficit, but we don't want to be that big that we're going to go into an energy deficit. How do you approach losing weight and nutrition? How you balance it?
It's such a great question, and I feel like for athletes, like the best approach is to, you can't chase two rabbits at once. So you cannot chase performance and you can't chase body composition at the same time because they're competing goals. It's a little bit like that adopting a low carb approach. Like I would approach a fat loss approach in my off season. Not that we have an off season, but in our base training phase, or when we're doing events, but they're not that important to us. It's fine if we have a bit of a B performance ourselves. Sustainable fat loss, or I'll say fat loss and weight loss, and I do use them interchangeably, I guess, but it's about between 0.4 to 1% of body weight each week. Often we see on social media these huge weight loss sort of transformations, but they're not in the endurance space, So you want to protect your training and protect your muscles. So the slower you go, the more likely it is that you'll be doing that. And that's not a lot, Joost. So I think being patient as an athlete and sort of having this long-term view, like if you've got, let's say, 10 kilos to lose, like give yourself at least 6 months to lose it. And even 10 months to lose it, so you might only be losing a kilo a month, but it will be having this sort of marked difference on your performance and your ability to recover. I do so in a calorie deficit as well, I like, as I mentioned earlier, like protecting training, so making sure you are fueling around training, having the majority of your carbohydrate post training, or if those sessions are more high intense, as we discussed, I do like having some carbohydrate pre-training to make sure you get through that training, which is obviously a different goal from trying to build your fat metabolism per se. But protect your training as much as you can, and then sort of build your plate the way that I talked about. Protein requirements will go up with a fat loss goal, so I would say at least 2.2 grams per kg body weight, if that's the case, and then ensuring that you've got an abundance of the vegetables that really help sort of fill you up, so you have that sort of satiety. One other thing which I think really helps when an athlete is in a calorie deficit, and you mentioned it with how you coach your athletes, like if you do have these longer sessions, some of the mistakes athletes make is to just go for really long time with no fueling. They're like, I'm getting bang for buck because I'm fasted training and then I'm going out for hours just on electrolytes. Like, you don't want to do that. Like, you want to feel good as an athlete as well. So I encourage people to continue to fuel post 90 minutes in a training session, to make sure that they're able to perform at that level that they're wanting to. A couple of other things I like is a multivitamin, because it's very hard to get everything you need from food alone when your calories are restricted. Even actually if your calories aren't, and I will say this is a recommendation for just athletes in general, should be having a multivitamin, a good quality one. And then the other thing, or I guess the last thing is that if you're consistent with your diet, the way that you are with your training, then you will see results. And so stay patient, and don't think if you have one meal off plan that you've ruined it all and you may as well start again on Monday. So it's trying to avoid that all or nothing thinking that gets us trapped in this binge sort of restrict cycle that a lot of people can get into.
Yeah. Well, it's a very nice and balanced approach that you explained here, and it's also targeted. It protects your training and have patience. Patience is the game, and it's something we're not always good at as runners.
Not at all.
In everything.
No, I know. We're the worst. It's like you have an injury, like, oh, I'm going to go test this injury. Am I still injured? Like 2 days later. Of course you are, because we're so impatient with our recovery and our ability to heal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Mikki, thank you very much for this conversation. It was absolutely brilliant. We covered all bases in nutrition, and there's lots more to talk about, but we'll save it for another time. Where can athletes find you to work with you?
Thank you so much, Joost. I really, as I said, I could talk for hours on this, as you know. So I am on Instagram at Mikki Williden. I have a podcast, you mentioned it, it's Wikipedia, and I talk to sort of researchers and people in fitness and nutrition and health, and I've got a particular interest in metabolic health as well. And my website, mikkywilliden.com. So if you scroll right to the bottom of that website, you can put your name in a little box and you jump on my weekly email list. So those are the main places where people can find me.
Brilliant. And also saw on your website that you have a special meal plan for athletes as well that you can help.
I do, and it is a low carb one, but it actually just sort of puts these principles we've discussed sort of into practice. Takes the thinking out of it for athletes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Nice one.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time, Mikki, and until next time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. That's a wrap for today's episode, and a huge thank you to Mikki for joining us on the Aerobic Edge podcast. This was exactly the type of conversation I'm looking for in this podcast. Zero fluff, evidence-based and practical. I hope you have some pointers you can use for the coming weeks within your nutrition and your training. If you want to work with Mikki or find out more about her, she's on Instagram at Mikki Williden. Her podcast is Mikkipedia, and I highly suggest you subscribe to her podcast, and her website is mikkywilliden.com. She works with all kinds of athletes and she can help you become a healthier runner. So it's definitely worth checking out. If you like today's episode and the information we give on this podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to get out there between all the thousands of other running podcasts. So thank you for listening, and until next time.